Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier. Thank you for stopping by. I hope the week's gone well. Certainly some sad news coming out of Nice. We'll get to that in a moment. I attended and spoke at the Moody's conference in Nairobi yesterday about Africa. Very interesting and insightful, I must say. And lots of detail. Moody's are expecting Kenyan non-performing loans to peak at 10% before an improvement kicks in. A presentation was made about credit trends affecting Kenyan banks, and the headline of that presentation was "Not all banks are equal." I said the Eurobond market has been an accurate indicator of the perception on African economies, and I was referring to some of the big blowouts we've seen in Angola and Mozambique, for example. I follow a chap called Nicky Oz on Twitter, and he's pretty interesting about analysing algorithmic and high-frequency trading. Have a look at this tweet he put out. HFT algo, which runs after the price and gets filled for 43 contracts at $1,330. Staircase structure. You can see what he means. Earlier, before the Bank of England announcement that they weren't going to cut rates, the markets had priced in an 86.5% probability of a rate cut. Bank of England then confounded expectations, left its key rate at a record low, and said it's readying stimulus for August as the economy reels from Britain's decision to quit the European Union. The 9-member MPC, led by Governor Mark Carney, voted 8-1 to keep the benchmark at 0.5%. The pound surged after the announcement. It's up about 3% this week versus the dollar, on for its biggest weekly rise since 2009, but it's still 10% below Brexit levels. We were at the Maasai Mara last weekend, and there were about 60,000 wildebeest in the Mara by that point. The total expected are 1.5 million. I returned to Marshall Mcluhan. Our technology forces us to live mythically. Our permanent address is tomorrow. We become what we behold. We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. Let me put up an image of the experimental solar plane, Solar Impulse 2, flying over the pyramids in Cairo. Take dessert. I like this. The peaches and cream come with crumbly shards of rose meringue. And given what's happened in Nice, I return to the laureate of terror, Don Delillo. And this is an article by Martin Amis, and he's quoting from a book, The Specialist. And I've read this before, but I really think it's fantastic. The Specialist is monitoring data on his mission console when a voice breaks in, a voice that carried with it a strange and unspecifiable poignancy. He checks in with his flight dynamics and conceptual paradigm officers at Colorado Command, and we ask ourselves, has there ever been a more distinctive exponent of dialogue than Don Delillo? We have a deviate tomahawk. We copy, there's a voice. We have gross oscillation here. There's some interference. I've gone redundant, but I'm not sure. It's helping. We are clearing an outframe to locate source. Thank you, Colorado. It is probably just selective noise. You are negative red on the step function quad. It was a voice, I told them. We have just received an affirm on selective noise. We will correct Tomahawk. In the meantime, advise you to stay redundant. The voice, in contrast to Colorado's metallic pigeon, is a melange of repartee, laughter, and song, with a quality of purest, sweetest sadness. Somehow we were picking up signals from radio programs of 40, 50, 60 years ago. Temporal bandwidth is the width of your present, your now. It is the familiar AI considered as a dependable variable. The more you dwell in the past and in the future, the thicker your bandwidth, the more solid your persona, and the narrower your sense of now, the more tenuous you are. At least 80 people were killed after an attacker drove a lorry into crowds celebrating Bastille Day in the city of Nice. Another 100 were injured. The attacker behind the wheel on Thursday drove at high speed along the famed Promenade des Anglais seafront, hitting the mass of spectators who had been watching a fireworks display. Police later shot and killed the driver. Identity papers belonging to a 31-year-old French Tunisian were found inside the truck, a police source told the AFP. Takes me back to some thoughts I'd had previously when I said in a world of more than 7 billion souls, the fat tail people prepared to do this kind of thing is actually quite a large number. I visited Nice many years ago. I had a friend who was a Palestinian writer called Said Abarish who lived there. And I saw a tweet from Sarah Dunker, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Pray for Nice. I tweeted this morning, good morning world. We pray for France, pray for Nice, and for every innocent life that has been lost to these maniacs everywhere. On the 29th of March, I wrote about how countries are paying a heavy price for less costly terror attacks. You just need one person who's prepared to die. And you think of the cost of the defense against that individual. As I scanned the news and the names of the attackers, I looped back to one of my French O-level books, the inestimable Albert Camus' L'Étranger, and this quote, the Byronic hero, and they're not, but they think they are, incapable of love or capable only of an impossible love, suffers endlessly. He is solitary, languid, his condition exhausts him. If he wants to feel alive, must be in the terrible exaltation of a brief and destructive action. I was talking about Najib Lachoui and Ibrahim el-Bakraoui. And I said in the financial markets there is a concept called tail risk. Tail risk is the risk of an asset or portfolio of assets moving more than 3 standard deviations from its current price. So I'm talking about human beings or more than 3 standard deviations from the average. For example, in early January, it took just 15 minutes on a Monday morning for South Africa's rand to plummet 9%. I'm saying the examples are numerous in the markets. If the markets are a mirror, then they are certainly reflecting a new normal around volatility and tail risks. Therefore, my first question is, how big is the tail risk in our world of more than 7 billion? Let's say 0.5% of 7 billion, that's 35 million people. Drop that to 0.05%, and you still have 3.5 million. So that's my first point. The absolute number of folks who are prepared to cross the edge is a big absolute number. The edge, by Hunter S. Thompson, there is no honest way to explain it, because the only people who really know where it is are the ones who have gone over. Terrorists are waging asymmetric warfare. They cannot stand toe-to-toe with a conventional army because they would be annihilated. However, what they're doing is exploiting an asymmetric opening. Jean-Claude Juncker requested a minute of silence, posted this photograph. According to Ian Bremmer, 1,700 French citizens have gone to fight in Iraq and Syria. Only 250 have returned. Returning to Don Delillo and Mao too, in societies reduced to blur and glut, terror is the only meaningful act. There's too much everything, more things and messages and meanings that we can use in in 10,000 lifetimes. Inertia, hysteria. Is history possible? Is anyone serious? Who do we take serious? Only the lethal believer, the person who kills and dies for faith. Everything else is absorbed. The artist is absorbed. The madman in the street is absorbed, processed and incorporated. Give him $1. Put him in a TV commercial. Only the terrorists stand outside. The culture hasn't figured out how it might assimilate him. It's confusing when they kill the innocent, but this is precisely the language of being noticed, the only language the West understands, the way they determine how we see them, the way they dominate the rush of endless streaming images. And then another quote from him: there's a curious knot that binds novelists and terrorists. Years ago, I used to think it was possible for a novelist to alter the inner life of the culture. Now, bomb makers and gunmen have taken that territory. They make raids on human consciousness, what writers used to do before we were all incorporated. The Syrian army has made a lot of advancement recently, President Assad told NBC News. It won't take more than a few months, he said. Expressed confidence that Syria's bloody war could be won within months. Spoke to NBC, the interviews on the link that I have on Rich Wrap-Ups. The Syrian army has made a lot of advancement recently. The Russian support of the Syrian army has tipped the scales against the terrorists. It was the crucial factor. 6 years later, Assad is still in power and stronger than ever, but not crowing about outplaying Obama. He's failed, but that doesn't mean I win. Because for him, the war is to remove me. For me, the war is to restore Syria. If we can get rid of those terrorists, if we can restore the stability in Syria, this is where we win. Otherwise, you cannot talk about winning. He accused successive US administrations of stoking chaos around the world, becoming more and more pyromaniac. Syrian parliamentary elections. There's a photograph of President Assad and his wife Asma as they went to vote in Damascus. Time magazine is talking about the siege of Aleppo could spell disaster for rebels fighting Syria's Bashar al-Assad, saying it's now effectively under siege with potentially disastrous consequences for the 5-year rebellion against the regime of Assad. If the siege of Aleppo continues, it could devastate Syria's mainstream rebel groups. It does not mean the Assad regime would decisively win the war. Jihadist groups will continue to fight on. But I think this informs us of why Erdogan sought a rapprochement, why Kerry is currently in Moscow talking to Putin. I think essentially some of these assets have been obliterated. Look at this photograph of Aleppo taken a while back. It was an extraordinary city which has been largely destroyed. Vladimir Putin and John Kerry shake hands during a meeting at Moscow's Kremlin on July 14th. They're there with a proposal aimed at curtailing violence in Syria ahead of an August 1 deadline. Over 800 came to hear Boris Johnson's first all-staff meeting at the Foreign Office, standing room only apparently. Have a look at the photograph. Boris headed to Brussels as the EU criticised Brexit tactics. He lied a lot to the British people, and now he finds himself with his back against the walls of the French Foreign Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault. Boris Johnson spent part of his life in Brussels. It's time for him to come back to Brussels in order to check if everything he's telling the British people is in line with the reality, said Juncker. Let's see, I think it's a very clever ruse by Prime Minister Theresa May to put him there. Big winners in the UNCLOS affair are the PRC's zero-sum competitors, Japan and the United States. The door is open for America's friends and allies to pursue more aggressive policies in the South China Sea, is the conclusion in Asia Times. Put up an image of the South China Sea. Let's move on to the currency markets where everything's been happening. The euro, 111.37. Dollar index around 96. Dollar yen topped 106, 105.82 right now. Swissy, 0.9805. The pound, 133.73. Aussie, 0.7632. India rupee, 67.085. South Korean, 111.3340. Real 325.05, Egyptian pound 8.8804, and the rand 14.2822, and right at the top of the trading range. Sterling, I'll put up a 1 month chart. No rate cut, confounded and burned the shorts, but we're now coming off the highs that we saw. The Japanese currency, the yen, has declined 4.9% against the dollar this week, and is the worst performer among the 16 major currencies. This is all because of Shinzo Abe's decisive win, in the sense that he can now decisively raise his Abenomics program. 1 month historical volatility rose to its highest since December 2008 on Thursday. Dollar yen, let me put up a 1 month chart. Breaking China data out, Q2 GDP up 6.7%. Estimate was for 6.6%, so that's pretty good. Quarter on quarter, plus 1.8%. Industrial production, plus 6.2%. Retail sales up 10.6%. All better than forecast. David Inglis tweets Nintendo's astonishing peak in one chart. Pokemon Go lifts its market cap from $20 billion to $35 billion, past some very big names. Commodity markets, gold, 1332 trading. Crude oil softer, 45.82 trading in New York. And we've come off those highs we saw close to 50. Sub-Saharan Africa, DRC, is unlikely to hold a presidential election as scheduled in November. The UN head of mission, MONUSCO, said there on Thursday something that UN experts have warned could trigger violent political unrest. President Kabila, in power since 2001, is bound by term limits to step down after having won elections in 2006 and 2011. But opponents accuse him of deliberately delaying the November 27th poll to cling to power. I do not see the elections taking place on November the 27th, UN Mission Chief Maman Siduku told a news conference in Kinshasa. The country's highest court ruled in May that Kabila would remain in power until the election is held. It is the Congolese who will decide when the elections will take place, Siduku said. Kabila's close advisor says the Congo leader will quit, but not this year, eventually leave office, but must continue to govern Africa's biggest copper producer until delayed elections can be held, one of his most senior advisors said. There will be no transition, Kikaya said. Kabila will continue to govern the country until there is a newly elected president. Moishi Katumbi is currently out of the country, so talks must lead to vote in 2016. After the date, no one will recognize the Kabila government, he said by phone from Washington. He must leave with his head high. Morocco is returning to the African Union after 32 years of absence. This is via CCTV Africa. South Africa's economy jumps Egypt, closes in on Nigeria. Nigeria is still Africa's #1 economy, even after a 30% devaluation of the naira last month, knocked almost $150 billion of its GDP when measured in dollar terms. The gap with Nigeria has narrowed to $60 billion now from $170 billion at the end of 2015. That was when Nigeria overtook South Africa. African visual data chart, democracy versus market economy. Rwanda is an exception. South African all shares up 4.23% this year. Dollar rand, as I said, is at the top of the range, 14.20 area. Wouldn't want to see it go through that, otherwise it's going to see a 13 handle. Egyptian EGX30 up 8.24% this year. Nigerian all share up 0.21% this year. Ghana Stock Exchange down 10.41% this year. The Economist has an article, Mozambique fishy finances. We've spoken about this before. Who cares about the tuna fish? Asked a fund manager a year or so ago, explaining his decision to buy bonds issued by a Mozambique government-backed company that planned to use the money to buy a brand new fleet of fishing boats Instead, this investor and many others look simply at the government guarantee that underpinned the deal. Even if not a single tuna were caught, the loans would still be repaid since the government would step in. Faced with a shoal of troubles, it now appears to be on the brink of default. Government bonds are trading at about 70% of face value this week. Moody's downgraded the country, saying it was very near to defaulting. Talking about the problems that led to this, saying that the swap was going through, then it was revealed that Mozambique had secretly borrowed another $1.4 billion, or about 10% of its GDP, making it the most indebted country in sub-Saharan Africa. The revelation shocked the IMF and Western donors into freezing disbursements to the government, whose budget relies on international aid. It also led to red faces at Credit Suisse and VTB, the two banks that helped arrange the various bond sales. Some of the investors who bought the bonds complained that the bank should have given them more information. Yet it seems to have induced almost no shame in the government. The IMF and Western donors are pressing for an independent audit of the secret loans, yet Felipe Nyusi is dragging his feet, prompting speculation that a cover-up is underway. Mozambique is not alone in its fiscal fishiness. Economic crisis is stalking Angola, which is also suffering from the slumping price of oil, its main export. Its bonds tumbled earlier this month after José Eduardo dos Santos, its president since 1979, said the country was collecting barely enough revenue to service its debt. It too has been in bailout talks with the IMF, but called them off after seeing the fund's conditions on fighting corruption. This is a debacle. Put up a photograph of Maputo taken one evening when I was there. Angola's June inflation outpaced the rest of the region at 31.8%, highest official inflation rate of at least 12 southern African nations. The inflation rate more than tripled from a year earlier as a slump in crude oil prices cut government revenue and resulted in the kwanza weakening 26% against the dollar. Zimbabwe has missed its own deadline to pay $1.8 billion. Right now, we've not paid anything. Irrespective of the calendar for arrears clearance, the economy needs immediate reforms to address the vulnerabilities that have come to the fore. This is the IMF's race. Expeditious implementation of those reforms is critical to reverse Zimbabwe's economic decline. I think we're in the death spiral now. Moving to Kenya, a rogue officer who went berserk was responsible for an attack at a police station in western Kenya on Thursday, in which 7 people died. The IMF has warned Kenya around 313 billion shillings of undisclosed debt risk. The Treasury is carrying a heavy load of undisclosed debt in the form of power sector guarantees made in the past 10 years. The guarantees totaling 313 billion shillings, which the IMF has flagged in its latest report on Kenya, were in support of power purchase agreements between Kenya Power and independent power producers. Information on active public-private partnership contracts worth up to $3.4 billion, or 5.7% of GDP, have not been made public or accounted for in official public finance documents, meaning that their fiscal implications are yet to be fully assessed. Rhodes Levy has pushed the petroleum price to an 11-month high this Friday morning, buoyed by the coming into effect of the 6 shilling road maintenance levy. And it's pretty much across the board. That's not good, but let's see how we handle it going forward. BAT reported first half earnings per share accelerated 10.665%. Revenue was down 1.469%. Profit before tax up 10.638%. Talking about operating profit up 6%, operating margin improved by 2.1 percentage points to 30.2% during the period. Interim dividend of 3 shillings and 50 cents a share. It's a really strong share. It's going to continue to perform. Have a look at this chart comparing BAT PLC, which has outperformed even more, versus BAT Kenya. Then have a look at this chart of Standard Chartered PLC versus Standard Chartered Kenya. I was talking to Lamine about that yesterday. If you need the link for Standard Chartered's share price, that's at the bottom of Rich Wrap-Ups. Nairobi All Shares down 4.76%. The top 3 performers and the top worst performers are found in this Bloomberg chart that I'm attaching. And finally, the NSE 20 is still at a 50-month low, down 10.66% year to date. Thank you for stopping by.